voters of the Bridgeport area, and I'd like to thank all of you for being here this evening. The debate this evening will be between Vicky Tesoro, the Democratic candidate for the first Selectman Town of Trumbull, and Mark Block, the Republican candidate for the first Selectman Town of Trumbull. Just a quick note that that the doors will lock at 8 o'clock. You're welcome to leave, but you can't come back after 8 o'clock. So you can wave at us at the door. So the forum will consist of 9 questions. We have lots of good questions that people have submitted. So the coin toss showed that Mr. Tesoro will go second and Mr. Block will go first in any of the questions. Each candidate will have a 2-minute opening. The second candidate will have 2 minutes to answer the question after the first question is proposed. The candidate who spoke first will be allowed a 1-minute rebuttal. The candidate who spoke second will be allowed a 1-minute rebuttal. When all the questions have been asked, each candidate will have a 3-minute closing. Now, I hope you've got that all down pat. Right? Okay. So, let our forum begin. And so, Mr. Block, you have 2 minutes.
We'd like to do the Pledge of Allegiance before we start, if that's okay.
I'm sorry.
That wasn't in the... I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So, Mr. Block, 2 minutes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you and good evening. I'm Mark Block, as you said, and I'm a candidate for First Selectman for Trumbull. I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters for moderating this evening and all those in attendance here and those watching on Trumbull Community Television, those who have submitted questions in advance for tonight's debate. I'd also like to extend my thanks to Mrs. Tesoro for agreeing to join me for this evening and on our next evening scheduled for Thursday, October 28th. This evening you'll have the opportunity to hear 2 very different approaches on how to move the town forward. I'm going to offer you a vision of a community that is better than the one we have today. I'll show you how I will lead from the front, not follow from behind. I'll be a proactive, not a reactive leader. As Mrs. Tesoro herself was quoted in a recent article, she appears to be happy and content with the status quo. I believe we can change that. We've had 4 years of that, and it no longer can move us forward. We find ourselves at an inflection point on the direction this community will take in the next 2 years. Over the course of the evening, I'll present you with my vision that focuses on growing our grand list with a balance of commercial, retail, and residential growth, controlling spending by introducing creative, out-of-the-box ways to save money, like joining with our neighboring communities to leverage our purchasing power, addressing our aging infrastructure, which includes our roads and schools, maintaining our school system and
added $12 million of additional funding to our school system, far more than the previous administration. We will continue to invest in education because it's right for our community. Every taxpayer benefits from a strong school system. Our students are well prepared. They succeed in college, in business, and in the military. This is a small sample of what we have achieved. I look forward to talking more about all we have done and all that we intend to do this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. First question is from Mr. Block.
The budget, I continue to do that. We concentrate on conservative fiscal budgeting, restrained spending, which is what has been the secret of keeping our taxes stable in Trumbull, and we will continue to do what has worked. And again, I will also be looking at strategic economic development, because it is through growing our grand list and restrained spending and conservative budgeting that we keep our taxes stable. And again, Trumbull Center, I will agree with you, is an issue for the community. It always has been. We will continue to work with the landlord and provide services for him to want to grow the Trumbull Center. Again, we are doing a corridor study of White Plains Road to enhance development in that area. But again, everyone knows that is private property. We can only encourage. But if you attended my business breakfast last Friday, you would have heard that the landlord is thinking about bringing an application forward for a mixed-use development in Trumbull Center. So we're looking forward to that happening and encouraging that and doing whatever the town can do to help that development in Trumbull Center. And then, of course, the other big issue is our mall. And I'm probably sure that you've all seen the development that is starting down there. We are hoping that will be a catalyst to development to transform our mall, our biggest taxpayer. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Block, do you have a rebuttal?
There's just a couple of things I'd like to add, and there's a fundamental difference that the First Selectman and I have, and that's fine. The funding of what we refer to as our rainy day fund, that to me is taxpayer money that the town is saying by putting in that fund, which was already 100% funded, that the town can better save your money than you can save your own money. I believe you can save your money better than the town can, and I'd like to see that money come back to your pocket so you can decide what you want to do with it. Hopefully that's supporting our local businesses. When it comes to other funds, $5 million in federal funds that came to the town this past year, unlike other communities that had community forums, had open meetings, residents were asked what they wanted to do with those funds. The administration took those funds and put them in the annual operating budget. And on top of that, we received a tax increase. And on top of that, they took our money and said, we can save it better than you can. I have a fundamental difference with the administration when it comes to that.
Thank you. Mr. Sorrow, do you have a response to that? No? Okay.
That's not the rules. Do I get a response to his rebuttal?
Sure, go ahead.
I do?
That's what it said.
Oh, it does? Well, if I
Okay.
do, well, sure. I'll have a response. So I'm just confused about what you said about the rainy day fund, and maybe you could explain that again. But certainly, and I'm also sure that you're aware, because of 2017 or 2016, March of 2016, you actually voted on a ordinance that you can't go below 10% the operating fund of the rainy day fund. So we were very close to that at 11%. So to go any lower, that would be a problem that we'd actually be breaking our own law. So we in fact did return that money to our taxpayers when we used $2.8 million, which in the end, we actually didn't have to use. So we didn't actually go into our rainy day fund for the 2021 budget, because we had a large surplus in the end of the year because of COVID. And I don't want to blame everything on COVID, but we were able to save money and didn't touch that general fund. So it's still there. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question for Mr. Sorrow. What are the 3 biggest challenges facing the Trumbull Public Schools, and what would you do to address them?
Thank you. Well, again, I'll start off with the COVID impact, because certainly for the last year and a half, that has been the biggest obstacle for our schools. And I have to give credit to our teachers and our administrators for the fabulous job that they did last year and continue to do, but last year when they had to teach remotely, and how difficult that is. I was in a first grade classroom this morning doing a read aloud, so I can't imagine, having to have done that, teaching our kids remotely, especially for our elementary school kids. But the COVID impact is still here, and I applaud our superintendent, who is actually working with the state to reduce the quarantine time that our kids have to be out from school because of the impact, the large impact that already has had. And that's the second issue that concerns me, and that's the learning gap for some of our students. And I know that, again, our superintendent and administrators are working tirelessly to close that gap for our students. And through the American Rescue Plan funding and the budget, they were able to hire more resource teachers in math and English, especially at the elementary and middle school level, to address that learning gap. The last thing that I would like to talk about as far as our schools is the aging infrastructure of our schools. 2 years ago or more, I asked for a 10-year capital plan for the schools. And I got that plan, but I would have to say, based on that plan, which was done in a rush, that it wasn't really well thought out or researched. So I know that the Board of Ed has hired a new facilities director who is now working on a new 10-year plan to put forward. So I'll be very interested to see that, how we can work together to make sure that we're taking care of our aging infrastructure in our schools. Thank you.
Mr. Block, the same question for you. The biggest challenge facing Trumbull Public Schools?
Sure. I think that there's a few significant challenges. Mr. Sora touched on one that we agree on, and that's the infrastructure of our buildings. Unfortunately, we learned through this pandemic that we need to do a much better job of ventilation in our schools. That is to protect both our students, our staff, and those who visit. And I believe that we could have used some of that $5 million in federal funds that came this past year, and I would strongly urge under my administration, we will use $5 million of those funds to work on our schools. I'm concerned about the curriculum. I'm concerned about what our kids are listening to, what our staff is bringing forward to them. I'm concerned that there is less parent participation. I'd like to see our schools work with our students to teach them how to think critically rather than critically think. And it's important that our kids learn that as they go through our public school system, just as I did. We were taught how to think. We weren't taught what we should think. And that to me is probably, in my opinion, the biggest issue that faces our schools right now.
Thank you. Mr. Soro, do you have a response?
Yes, I would just ask Mr. Black how he is aware of what he had just said of how we're teaching our kids in our schools. Have you had conversations with Board of Ed members, with teachers, with administrators? Our schools, I think we need to celebrate our schools at this particular point in time. And tonight I'd like to celebrate two of our schools, who have been recognized by U.S. World Reports as, I believe, Hillcrest Middle School is the #4 middle school in our state, and Daniels Farm is the #9 elementary school in our state. So I think we should certainly celebrate that. And as far as what we're teaching in our schools, our students are so well prepared. You should have conversations with kids who graduate and go on to colleges, and they report how well they are prepared compared to their peers from surrounding communities. So I'm not sure where you're getting the information about what we're being taught in school, but I don't hear that same information. In fact, our superintendent of schools absolutely said that CRT was not being taught in our schools.
Mr. Block?
Sure, I'm happy to, look, I talk to teachers, I talk to staff, I talk to parents, I talk to administrators, and I talk to my daughter, who is a graduate of Trumbull Public Schools just like I was. The teaching that goes on today is not the teaching that she had, and she graduated in 2011. It's certainly not the teaching that I had a few years before that. When I look at the organizations that have been brought in to talk to the Board of Education, an organization like CERC, which talks about believing and thinking and feeling and acting and examining the presence and the role of quote-unquote whiteness, I have concerns about that. I have concerns about that as a community member. I have concerns about that for our community's children.
Thank you. Our next question, as a homeowner, I am concerned about the impact a new apartment complex near the mall, as well as a quickly deserting Trumbull Center area will have on the home values in schools. What plan do you have to revitalize Trumbull Center and ensure current residents that are impacted physically by new apartments? Please elaborate on short and long-term plans. Mr. Block.
Sure, thank you again for the question. I think that Mrs. Sora and I probably agree very much on this, that there needs to be a balance in town, a balance between residential, commercial, and retail. The town, in my opinion, is no longer balanced. The tax burden is falling much too heavily on the residents, and there is less of that tax burden on our retail and our commercial, and we need to see a change in that. As I said, when it comes to Trumbull Center, I know the developer. I'm going to sit down with the developer. on my first week in office, and I'm going to say to him, tell me what it is that you want. What do you want in order to do something with the property that you have down the hill? If you can't tell me what you want, what you need, then I'm going to again ask you to sell that to somebody who will do something with it. When it comes to the mall, I've been very clear on my position for many months now, and this has to do with apartments. These are not condominiums, these are apartments. In my opinion, apartments are transitory by their very nature. I said that what I would want to see with the mall is not what the 7 acres were that they were going to do, but the 77 acres that they own, the totality of it. Something needs to be done to make that a livable, workable, entertainment, enjoyable section of our community. It's not that now. And that's another conversation that we'll have directly with them. And those conversations are going to be open, they're going to be transparent, there's going to be community involvement, there's going to be resident involvement in those conversations, and we're going to decide what we can do best to make those properties be properties that we are proud to have in our community rather than properties we're constantly talking about in our community.
Thank you. Mr. Sorrell.
Thank you. So let me just say that it's important to remember that our town is already 90% developed. There's very little land to develop Trumbull any further. The apartments, again, we know that we have a little bit of a history now of apartments in Trumbull. We have the apartments down at 10 Trumbull and the Woodside apartments that are being built right now. And we were able to fully rent the 10 Trumbull apartments within 6 to 9 months. I don't have 30 seconds, do I?
No.
Oh, sorry. And the Woodside apartments are renting as fast as they're going up. So obviously there's a need for that type of a place for people to live in Trumbull. It's another type of varied housing stock. The apartments at the mall, again, when I spoke about this before, the mall is one of our biggest challenges in town. It's also our biggest taxpayer. We must do everything we can to make sure that we do what we can to transform that mall into live, work, play. And this is the first step to do that. There are studies that have been done, many, many studies, because we're not the only town that has a mall like Trumbull has. There's many of these malls across the country are also struggling with redeveloping their properties in order to make sure that we can save this property, which again, I keep stressing the fact, it's our biggest taxpayer. We must do everything we can. And then building these apartments is the first step to transforming this mall. Do I have an actual crystal ball to determine what the future will be? I do not. But I need to do everything I can as the first selectman to protect that asset for this community. And we must get a person or a developer, an owner.
In Milford, did it right. He stood up and he said, I don't want this here. I don't want it in my backyard. I don't want it in our city. We don't need it. And I'm going to do the same thing. If elected, I'm going to tell you what I think we need, I'm going to tell you what I believe we should have, and I'm going to tell you when I don't think we ought to have something. I'm going to be open and I'm going to be forthright with you. I'm not going to hide behind, I'm not saying Mr. Sorrow is, I'm just going to say I'm not going to hide behind anything that's going to cause anybody to wonder what it is that's going on in town. Other communities around the country, all over the country, have reimagined and redeveloped their town centers and their malls. It's time that we stop talking about it. It's time that we don't ask developers what they want to do. It's time that we demand that they do something, or we ask them to sell the properties that they have to those developers who actually want to do something. I'm ready to tell them to do that.
Mr. Sorrell, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. Okay, again, private property owner. The town can't demand that a private property owner do anything. You can ask him to sell his property, but doesn't need to do that. We need to work with them. We need to collaborate with them. We need to offer our services. As I said, we have a world-class planning study going on the corridor of White Plains Road to assist the landlord, to show what we can do as a town together with him to develop that property. We hope now that he's